Bonjour, je m'appelle Marie Schubauer-Berigan et je suis chef du programme des monographies du CIRC, qui est le Centre international de recherche sur le cancer à Lyon. Et je m'excuse, mais je fais la présentation, l'intervention en anglais, parce que c'est pénible pour vous de m'entendre en français. Alors, so today I will be presenting to you a summary of 50 years of comprehensive cancer hazard identification, which we have just previously heard quite a bit about from Professeur Touvier. First of all, I think it's important to note that I declare no competing interests. And just as an overview of what I'll present today, I'll talk first about the IARC Monographs Program within the context of IARC itself. I'll talk about the evolution of the methodologies which are encapsulated in the preamble to the monographs, which describe the modernized evidence synthesis and integration across different evidence streams. I'll talk about priorities for the IARC monographs, emphasizing nutritional aspects of agents that we may evaluate in future. And then I'll close with future directions, emphasizing understanding and assessment of epidemiological biases that may influence our interpretations of data. So IARC itself, or CIRC, serves to generate data from interdisciplinary research. For example, you'll be hearing soon about the EPIC study in one of the future interventions. This was a major cohort study that had part of its foundation at IARC. In addition, IARC evaluates evidence through comprehensive and independent expert review. And it's this program, which is housed in the Evidence Synthesis and Classification branch, that I'll talk about today. One program in this branch is the WHO Classification of Tumors book series. This is extremely important because pathologists and doctors who are understanding the nature of tumors rely on the guidance from these syntheses. In addition, we have the IARC Handbooks of Cancer Prevention. And lastly, the program that I'll speak about now, the IARC Monographs on the Identification of Carcinogenic Hazards to Humans. This program has been within WHO since 1971, so for more than 50 years. We are known as the WHO's Encyclopedia of Carcinogens. And through our program, we've evaluated more than 1,040 agents. So you all know already that the global cancer burden is high and rising. This is due to what epidemiologists call the epidemiologic transition. And it's really due to two separate factors. One is changing demographics with populations aging globally. But the second is a shift in carcinogenic exposures, such as tobacco smoking, westernized dietary lifestyles, shifting these to low and middle income countries. We already know that prevention is the single most effective response to a rising cancer burden. And the first step in cancer prevention is to identify the causes of human cancer, which is the remit of the IARC Monographs program, and what prevents cancer, which is the subject of the IARC Handbooks program. You may wonder then, having heard Professor Touvier's explanation, how we actually convert thousands of pages of published studies into our iconic orange-hued volumes within the IARC monographs. It's all carried out through the preamble to the IARC monographs, which describes the methods that are used to evaluate the data. It was published first at the beginning of 1971 and has been updated many times as the science has evolved. In 2018, an advisory group of experts met in Lyon to review and update the preamble. What was new? What was needed then since 2006? First of all, there had been procedural advances in systematic review methods, but also, and more importantly, scientific advances in cancer epidemiology and especially in the mechanisms of carcinogenesis. So this group met and revised the preamble, and it still contains the procedural guidelines for selecting participants at the meeting, for managing and preventing conflicts of interest from having an influence on the evaluations, for involving the public and stakeholders, and for conducting the meeting itself. The preamble also describes the criteria that are used to review the human cancer, animal cancer, and mechanistic evidence. It gives the decision process for reaching the overall evaluations. And some highlights of the revised preamble include more transparency, increased rigor of the systematic review, and modernized methodologies. You may also wonder, who is it who carries out the monographs evaluations? It's all carried out by the working group, who are independent scientific experts who are free from conflicts of interest. It is they who review the science and develop the evaluations. They're assisted by the IARC Secretariat. We are also independent scientists, and we coordinate all aspects of the evaluation and ensure consistency through adherence to the preamble. In addition, 3 categories of participants may come to meetings but may not influence the evaluations. We may have invited specialists who have a deep knowledge about the subject matter, but they may have a competing interest. In this case, they may only write descriptive information about exposure in humans, but may not write about the evaluation. The representatives of governments and health agencies are often interested in watching what happens at a monographs meeting. And lastly, we may have observers. These are scientists who often have a competing interest. They may observe, but may not influence the outcomes of the meeting. So as you can imagine, with 50 years of history, we've had quite a lot of global participation in monographs meetings. Since 1971, more than 1,400 scientists globally from 58 countries have participated in one or more monographs meetings. We also have a process of public engagement that we follow. We announce each meeting about 1 year in advance, and we have a call for experts, which closes about 8 months before the meeting. The request for observers closes 4 months ahead, and our list of participants is published online together with conflicts of interest that are noted about 2 months ahead of the meeting. We publish a call for data, which closes a month ahead of the meeting, and then the meeting happens itself for 8 days in Lyon. The meeting results in a summary, which is published in a leading medical journal, The Lancet Oncology, within a couple weeks of the meeting. And then the monograph itself is published 9 to 12 months after the meeting. There are 3 streams of evidence that are considered in every monographs evaluation: cancer in humans, cancer in experimental animals, and mechanistic evidence. In addition, exposure to humans is characterized so that people can understand how they might be exposed to the agents that we are evaluating. We also use very modern systematic review tools to carry out the review. And Professor Touvier talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to dive into the methodology to at least a brief degree. Step 1 is to identify the relevant information, and we want to do so in an unbiased way. So we carry out extensive searches of the literature and document all of these using a tool that we call the Health Assessment Workspace Collaborative, which is made publicly available after the publication of the volume. We screen, select, and organize the studies for the working group, and then the data are extracted by the working group experts themselves. At the same time, they evaluate the quality of the study and report on the characteristics. We use a very standardized tool for extracting the information, which again ensures consistency across volumes. Working group members critique studies that they are not involved in, so people are not allowed to write about their own studies. There are also cross-subgroup discussions on important issues, for example, how well the exposure was characterized or measured in the study. Those happen ahead of the meeting. And there's also comprehensive peer review that takes place, first among the cancer epidemiology subgroup, and then across the whole working group. And what you see here in this figure is a table from the publication on red meat and processed meat. Whoops, I think I am pushing the wrong button. I can use the pointer probably. Yes, so here we see the study name, the publication, which cancer outcome was evaluated, the levels of exposure, and here we're using quartiles, as was explained before, and then the results of the study. So each monograph produces tables and tables, or pages and pages of tables like this. How then do the working groups come up with an overall evaluation after looking at perhaps hundreds of studies, as was the case for red meat and processed meat? Well, they use a very specific method that's described well in our preamble. First of all, there are 4 categories of descriptors that may be used, and they're applied to each different cancer type separately. So these 4 descriptors are sufficient evidence, limited evidence, inadequate evidence, and evidence suggesting lack of carcinogenicity, or ESLC. To reach a determination that evidence is sufficient, the working group considers that a causal relationship has been established. This means that there is a positive association, there's an increased risk of a cancer site with exposure to the agent, seen across the body of evidence, and chance, bias, and confounding, which are very technical epidemiological descriptions, but these are the main sources of error in observational studies, that the working group feels that these can be ruled out with reasonable confidence. Not with absolute certainty, but reasonable confidence. For a limited determination, the working group concludes that a causal interpretation is credible. However, chance, bias, and/or confounding could not be ruled out with reasonable confidence for that cancer site. For an inadequate determination, studies permit no conclusion about the causal association, or simply no data were available. For evidence suggesting lack of carcinogenicity, there must be high-quality studies covering the full range of exposure, which are consistent in not showing a positive association at any level of exposure. The evidence in experimental animals is described using the same 4 words: sufficient, limited, inadequate, and ESLC. However, because these are experimental studies, the criteria to be reached in drawing those conclusions are quite different for the animal bioassays, and I don't have time to go into that today. The evidence stream that changed the most in the last several years has been the mechanistic evidence. And here, our advisory groups have noted that there are many challenges in how to search systematically for relevant mechanisms for the causes of cancer. How can we bring uniformity to different assessments? How can we analyze the increasingly large literature efficiently? And most importantly, how do we ensure that we're not biasing our evaluation towards whichever mechanisms we think might be happening? To tackle these challenges, IARC convened 2 workshops after a meeting that was held about 12 years ago to look again at all of the known human carcinogens. And in these workshops, the working group tabulated all of the mechanisms by which these known causes of cancer operate. And they determined that they could identify what are called the 10 key characteristics, or KCs, of human carcinogens. These are the chemical and biological properties of the established human carcinogens. We like to call it the top 10 list of the ways that things can cause cancer. They're listed here on the left, and some of these mechanisms are quite technical. Professor Touvier has described some of these already in chronic inflammation, which may act for some causes of cancer, like processed meat. But there are many others as well, and one of the best studied is the one on genotoxicity, which is key characteristic 2. However, there's much emerging research on many other causes of cancer, including inducing epigenetic alterations, inducing chronic inflammation, and some of the other ones further down the list. So our advisory group determined that data on these key characteristics can provide evidence of carcinogenicity even in the absence of cancer endpoints in human. So it's a way to be proactive in protecting against carcinogens without requiring that people actually get cancer in order to demonstrate that. They can also be used to assemble data on the mechanisms of carcinogens without needing an a priori hypothesis or pathway by which an agent may cause cancer. So then the mechanistic evidence is evaluated using 3 descriptors. They may be strong, limited, or inadequate. And there are very specific criteria, which I won't go into in detail about each of these. But what's important to note is that there are 3 different mechanistic topics that can influence the overall evaluation. First is called mechanistic class, and this is a determination that an agent belongs to a class of other agents that have been found to be either carcinogenic or probably carcinogenic to humans. A good example of this was dioxins, which were known to be part of a mechanistic class that another group of agents called PCBs was belonging to. Another topic is, of course, the key characteristics of carcinogens. But these could be in 3 different types of systems. They could be in exposed people, they could be in human primary cells or tissues, or they could be in strictly experimental systems. And the advisory group viewed these as being an ordered system so that the evidence in exposed humans is more relevant than the other 2 evidence streams. Lastly, a working group could conclude that a mechanism that is seen in experimental animals actually does not operate in humans or is not relevant to humans. This is invoked fairly rarely in the Monographs program. So now we're going to look at step 5 of the systematic review process. This is where evidence is synthesized. This takes place during this 8-day meeting in Lyon. And as I mentioned already, the evidence is classified by each of the 3 streams into one of the categories. But then all 3 streams are integrated to reach an overall evaluation. We have 4 groups available. Group 1 is carcinogenic to humans. There are 126 agents in this category. Group 2A is probably carcinogenic to humans with 94 agents. Group 2B is possibly carcinogenic to humans with 322 agents. And surprisingly to some, the largest group is group 3, which is not classifiable as to its carcinogenicity to humans with 500 agents. So one major change in the new preamble is that now all 3 streams are integrated in a single step. We don't upgrade or downgrade agents anymore, they're integrated together. What hasn't changed is that sufficient evidence for cancer in humans will always lead to a group 1 classification, regardless of what the evidence is in the other 2 streams. Some recent examples of this from the monographs include opium consumption, which was evaluated 2.5 years ago, and a working group concluded that there was sufficient evidence for cancers of the larynx, lung, and bladder, and limited evidence for cancers of pharynx, esophagus, stomach, and pancreas. Last summer, a working group concluded there was sufficient evidence among firefighters for mesothelioma and bladder cancer, and limited evidence for melanoma and cancers of the colon, testis, prostate, as well as non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So occupational exposure as a firefighter was classified in group 1. If there is not sufficient evidence in humans, but there's the combination of sufficient evidence of cancer in experimental animals plus strong mechanistic evidence of KCs in exposed humans, this can also lead explicitly to a group 1 evaluation. And this is a really important determination because, again, we do not require humans to have actually developed cancer in order for us to reach a group 1 classification. It is a rather rare circumstance, but there are more than 250 agents for which we currently have sufficient evidence in experimental animals, but we don't have evidence of cancer in humans, usually because the studies have not been done. So here is where mechanistic studies in humans could cause a group 1 evaluation to occur if there's strong evidence for mechanisms of carcinogenesis. Group 2A is generally based on a combination of 2 or more streams, and it's less than sufficient in humans. So for example, limited evidence for cancer in humans, plus either or both sufficient evidence in animals or strong mechanistic evidence. So we had a solvent that was recently classified here with limited evidence for multiple myeloma. And night shift work, a complex exposure, of course, that takes place in the workplace, reached group 2A through the combination of limited evidence for cancer in humans and sufficient evidence of cancer in experimental animals, but it also had strong mechanistic evidence, although it was not in exposed humans. Another way to reach 2A is to have sufficient evidence for cancer in experimental animals and strong mechanistic evidence in primary human cells or tissues. So here the advisory group felt that human relevance was important. So if you don't have at least limited evidence of cancer in humans, you needed some evidence in humans, and human cells or tissues was required. So we have several agents, including acrolein, which is a component of tobacco smoke, air pollution, and cooking oils. It's a very strong sort of off-gassing from cooking oils. Cobalt metal, which can be a contaminant or present in food, and soluble cobalt salts. These were classified in group 2A on this basis. Trivalent antimony had evidence from exposed humans for lung cancer, as well as sufficient evidence for bioassays and strong evidence in human cells or tissues. So it was quite easy to classify this in group 2A. In addition, strong mechanistic class will cause a group 2A evaluation. So PCBs, which were classified in the same category as dioxins for mechanistic class, were classified in group 2A. And we have some recent examples of this, including aromatic amines and an epoxide. Lastly, if there's limited evidence for human cancer alone or sufficient evidence for cancer in animals alone, then we can have we can reach group 2B. And there are many, many agents that are in this category, usually things that people are not exposed to in isolation, so it's hard to carry out human epidemiology studies. If there is strong mechanistic evidence alone, we can have a group 2B evaluation. Crotonaldehyde and arecoline, which is the active ingredient in areca nut, the main component of betel quid, was classified in group 2B on this basis. And lastly, a combination of sufficient evidence in animals and strong mechanistic evidence without it being in human cells would still leave you in group 2B. And we had a number of number of agents in this category. Lastly, as always, we have a number that reach group 3. This is generally because the animal bioassay evidence is not strong enough to reach a firm conclusion about the animal bioassay evidence. So this very colorful slide, we often, after presenting that information, I realize it's a lot to take in, but people are curious about when we have sufficient evidence in humans, how often does it happen that we don't have any other evidence in the other two streams? And this slide, this colorful slide, can depict how rarely that happens. So what we see in the circle is the classifications of the last 10 years of agents that are environmentally relevant to humans. Group 1 is in the center. Group 2A in the concentric circles go out in group 2A, 2B, group 3. And the colors are important because they indicate the evidence stream that contributed to the evaluation. So if you just look at the inner circle, you see a lot of multicolored named agents. And the multicolor means that all three streams of evidence were contributing to the evaluation. So it's quite rare, in fact, for human cancer evidence to be the sole supporting evidence leading to a carcinogenicity evaluation. So working groups have a lot of difficult tasks ahead of them when they're carrying out a working group evaluation. They have to evaluate the study quality. And again, Professor Touvier well explained what many of the considerations are. Potential for biases to affect the results, the quality of the data collection methods, the appropriateness of the statistical analysis methods. All of these are aspects of study quality. But there's another important consideration, which is study informativeness. And by this, we mean the ability to detect the presence of an association if one exists, or the absence of an association if it's truly null. This goes beyond study power to consider the presence of an adequate exposure contrast and the adequacy of the latency between exposure and when the cancer occurred. It can also consider time windows of sensitivity, like breast sensitivity to carcinogens varies depending on hormonal status. It also considers exposure to the target organ. When synthesizing the evidence, I'm very glad to see that you've already heard about these viewpoints articulated by Sir Austin Bradford Hill, but they're quite influential even today. We use an adaptation of these viewpoints. The strength of the association, of course, is important. However, weak associations may be causal. And in the dietary sphere, we are often talking about weaker associations that may be less than an odds ratio of 1.5, let's say. The consistency of the associations is an important factor. However, it must take into account the variable quality and informativeness of the studies. The presence of an exposure-response relation is important. However, confounders may also exhibit exposure-response relations. Temporality of association is a sine qua non, as you know, and biological plausibility is an important factor. The working group goes into great detail in synthesizing the evidence, incorporating their assessments of the impacts of chance, bias, and confounding on causal conclusions. Their evaluations are specific to each cancer site, and they give an explicit documentation of the reasoning that the working group used in reaching its conclusion. So you may be wondering at this point, well, this is all expert judgment. How robust are these assessments in reality? We can actually evaluate this in a couple different ways. I have already mentioned volume 100, in which new working groups reviewed all of the more than 100 agents that had been classified at that time in group 1. All of them were reaffirmed in group 1. There wasn't a single agent that was downgraded to a lower rating. And for many, the evidence had strengthened since the previous evaluation. There's also broad concordance in the evaluations by the Monographs Programme with other hazard identification programs, as Professor Touvier has also shown you in the previous talk. Well, what about agents that have no evidence for carcinogenicity in humans, those that have inadequate evidence? We have a database to interrogate there as well. In 1985, a workshop was held in Oxford discussing interpretations of the so-called negative evidence from human studies, and they chose 10 agents that had sufficient evidence for animal bioassays. For most of these agents, this group concluded that the evidence in humans was likely to remain inadequate or even as suggesting lack of carcinogenicity. Well, what happened in the 40 years or so since then? 3 of the 10 agents have been found to have sufficient evidence in humans for cancer, and 4 of the 10 have had limited evidence in humans. So these dire predictions were not borne out. Improvements in the epidemiology study number, quality, and informativeness were key to these changes. So I'll turn briefly now to the priorities recommended for the monographs evaluation. Where are we headed in the future? I feel that this slide is already somewhat dated because we're getting near the end of the 5-year period that these priorities relate to. But this is a similar presentation as I just showed you, only this time the agents are the prioritized agents for evaluation during 2020 to 2024. And again, the colors indicate the evidence stream contributing to the evaluation, and the inner circle indicates the high priority agents, whereas those on the outer rim indicate medium or low priority. So once again, the colors are indicative of the evidence. Red means mechanistic evidence, blue means human cancer, yellow means cancer bioassay, and the combinations of those primary colors indicate combinations of evidence. So what can we see here? I know that this is a group very interested in nutritional epidemiology, so I'm focusing on some of the dietary factors that were accorded priority by our advisory group. The first that we are tackling are high priority agents, aspartame, methyl-eugenol, and isoeugenol. Of course, you know aspartame is an artificial sweetener which is in very high use globally. Methyl-eugenol and isoeugenol are natural components that are also manufactured as flavoring elements. So you can see the color of these is kind of interesting. Aspartame was nominated because there has a positive animal bioassay. However, in the intervening years, there has been emerging evidence in humans, including a study conducted by Professor Touvier in Nutritionnelle Santé. So we anticipate that there may be interesting results of the human cancer findings as well. Methyl-eugenol and isoeugenol have bioassay and mechanistic evidence. The other two human cancer relevant agents in the high priority list, very interestingly, are dietary salt intake. As you've already heard, there is evidence for sodium chloride being potentially carcinogenic, particularly for stomach cancer. And also very hot foods and beverages. Very hot beverages, and these are at an extremely high temperature of greater than 65 degrees Celsius, are listed as probably carcinogenic on the basis mostly of studies that have been conducted in India and other countries where hot mate and other beverages are consumed. However, there is also emerging evidence on very hot foods that could complement a reevaluation of hot beverages. Some of the lower priority agents include aflatoxins, sucralose, another artificial sweetener, isoflavones, cumene, indole-3-carbinol, and furans, which are widely present in food. Some other agents of interest for the nutritional community include things that might be contaminants of food, like pesticides. Although the evidence here, as you can see, that there is evidence in humans. They're either purple or multicolored, which means a combination of mechanistic and human cancer evidence, or all three streams combined. And there's a large list of pesticides in the medium and low priority list, as well as 3 in the high priority list. So I'd like to talk about opportunities for involvement for the research community. We're going to have our next prioritization meeting for the monographs a year from now, and this will set priorities for the subsequent 5 years. We seek nominations of agents suspected of causing cancer, particularly in nutritional settings, because we do feel that this is an emerging area of research. One example that I suspect will be nominated is processed food, highly processed food, since there has been quite a lot of active research on this in recent years. We produce a scientific. We also would like people to respond to the call for, we would like to entertain nominations to be on this advisory group. And then we also wish to point out that the research community publishes data that's critical for the monograph's evaluation. We establish our priorities on a 5-year basis, which we hope is an indication for the community that they need to publish their research. But we have a specific call about a year ahead so that people can finish up their studies so that they can be considered in the evaluation. I'm going to finish today, I think I do have a few minutes left, to talk about the future directions in terms of assessing biases in epidemiological studies. So one of the major challenges for working groups is deciding whether or not they can rule out bias with reasonable confidence. However, there's minimal guidance on how to actually do this in the context of systematic review for cancer hazard identification. There has been a recent focus on what we view as more problematic approaches that automatically view observational studies as being inferior, or that assign grading point scales in a very algorithmic way. So I'd like to I'm not sure how epidemiologically oriented this group is, but I wanted to illustrate a few of the questions that working groups have had to struggle with when they reach their conclusions. One example, could selection bias caused by different rates of participation in the case group and the control group, could they completely explain an odds ratio of 2, a doubling of risk in this study? Is confounding by co-exposure to arsenic in the workplace likely to explain the higher risk of lung cancer that we see for the workers exposed to antimony? Could smoking confounding completely explain the elevated risk of bladder cancer in this set of key studies? How important is non-differential measurement error as compared to recall bias in this set of studies? Those biases would tend to operate in 2 different directions. So working groups through the years have used a variety of approaches to address these types of problems. One is to explicitly evaluate exposure assessment quality in the human studies and to indicate the anticipated impact on the measures of association in terms of direction and magnitude of bias. Working groups are charged with a very important task of triangulating evidence across different types of study designs because they may have different types of bias. In addition, working groups often develop causal diagrams to help them identify confounders. There's no need to have adjustment for factors that are not confounders. And in fact, it may bias you to adjust for things that are not confounders. They also must recognize the trade-offs in different study designs. We've seen an emergence of the Mendelian randomization study design, and that may have merit for nutritional epidemiology studies if we have good genetic predictors for nutritional behaviors. The use of negative control outcomes can be an important tool of evaluating evidence. These are outcomes that are plausibly related to confounders, but not to the agent of interest. And an example of this could be COPD, which is very strongly related to tobacco smoking, but not very strongly related to, say, most dietary exposures. So if you do not see an association with COPD, it's likely that your result for lung cancer or colorectal cancer is not confounded by tobacco smoking. In addition, when you have little information on confounders, there are approaches, statistical approaches, that can be used to evaluate indirectly or under worst case approaches whether confounding is likely to be a serious threat to conclusions. So to tackle this, IARC, the Monographs Program, together with the NCI, convened a scientific workshop and are developing a scientific publication with the aim to develop a toolkit of epidemiological and statistical tools that working groups can use to assess bias, its impacts on the evaluation of studies. The target audience would be Monographs working groups, some who may have deep methods expertise and some who may not. And we aim to carry out worked examples throughout the book. The focus here is on cancer hazard identification, not risk assessment. And we aim to use a similar format to the very influential series, Statistical Methods in Cancer Research, the volumes by Breslow and Day that were published nearly 40 years ago. We convened this workshop in October of last year, and we brought 30 experts in epidemiological methods to Lyon, where they worked in subgroups to develop chapter text and examples. They also engaged in much discussion about different approaches to assessing bias. And we've got a draft already of the book. It's currently undergoing peer review. I won't go through all of the chapters here, but you can see that it touches on most of the topics that I have raised. And interestingly, chapter 7 is devoted to the research practitioners themselves. It's really a plea to the research community about how to make their studies more useful for cancer hazard identification. The examples that we're carrying throughout the book include radio frequency EMF radiation, this is mobile phone radiation, night shift work, which I've already mentioned, red meat consumption, which you've heard much about today. All three of these have no greater than limited evidence for humans. Opium consumption is also included, and this, of course, has sufficient evidence for 3 cancer sites. We published an editorial in the Occupational and Environmental Medicine Journal, which is a journal of BMJ, and we articulated why this was important and what we hope to achieve. And we aim to have this publication published about a year from now. It will be freely available to the public and the research community. For mechanistic evidence, we also have some future plans. We will convene an expert workshop in July of this year. And here, this workshop group will look at endpoint measurement for the KCs, including in exposed humans. Some of these are quite challenging to measure, like chronic inflammation, epigenetic effects. They'll also evaluate new developments in high throughput methodologies to allow us to interrogate rich data sets for cancer hazard identification. And they'll work on methods to integrate evidence across multiple KCs, because often when you have strong evidence for one KC, you may have strong evidence for another, because often carcinogens act through multiple mechanisms. So, in conclusion, cancer hazard identification remains important for cancer prevention, and including for nutritional epidemiology. The Monographs Program has for 50 years been a scientifically rigorous and a trusted source of information on cancer hazard identification and the causes of cancer. We are using modernized methods to synthesize and integrate evidence, and we would like to just express that there are many opportunities for the research community to get involved in setting the agenda for future cancer hazard identification, including for nutritional causes of cancer. With that, I'll thank the working groups, advisory groups, scientists, and staff of the monographs, as well as the funders, the National Cancer Institute, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, both in the US, as well as the European Commission, Directorate General for Work and Social Inclusion. And thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We are very lucky to have you today. Thank you for your presentation. It was really, really impressive. The huge work performed by IARC, and I know it's going on, and also the perspectives and the possibility for scientists to also propose carcinogens, potential carcinogens, and to orient potentially the work that will be done. So it's really great, huge process, and thank you very much.
Thank you.